Home secrets are
Lieutenant,
buried
your
so
attention
deep
to
that
detail is
even those who
commendable,
live them
but we
forget
need
they
to discuss
exist.
your latest
Sarah
report.
Martinez thought her past was safely locked away in classified files, hidden beneath years of ordinary life. SS, a small-town coffee shop owner. She had traded fighter jets for espresso machines, military medals for aprons, and the roar of engines for the gentle hum of conversation. For 15 years, she had served coffee with a smile, listening to customers' stories while keeping her own carefully hidden. But, on one ordinary Tuesday morning, when a distinguished gentleman in a crisp uniform walked into her cafe and spoke two words that shouldn't have existed outside of top-secret briefings, everything changed. Those two words, her old call sign, would shatter the quiet life she had built and reveal a story of courage, sacrifice, and a mission so classified that its success was never officially acknowledged. This is the true story of how a simple coffee order became the key that unlocked one of the most extraordinary military operations of the modern era, and how a woman who had spent years hiding in plain sight finally received the recognition she had never sought but always deserved. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Sunrise Cafe as Sarah Martinez wiped down the counter for what seemed like the 100th time that day. The familiar routine of preparing for another busy day had become second nature to her. Steam rose from the industrial espresso machine as she ran the cleaning cycle, the mechanical hissing sound mixing with the soft jazz playing from the speakers mounted in the corners of the cozy establishment. At 42, Sarah had found peace in the predictable rhythm of small-town life. Her cafe sat on the corner of Main Street and Fifth Avenue in Cedar Falls, a town of just over 8,000 residents nestled in the rolling hills of Montana. The building itself was a converted Victorian house, complete with original hardwood floors and tall windows that flooded the space with natural light. She had purchased it 12 years ago with her military savings and a small business loan, transforming the first floor into a warm, welcoming cafe while living in the apartment upstairs. The bell above the door chimed as her first regular customer of the day arrived. Mrs. Henderson, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s, shuffled in with her usual bright smile, and her worn leather handbag clutched tightly against her chest. She had been coming to Sunrise Cafe every morning for the past decade, always ordering the same thing: a medium coffee with cream and 2 sugars, and a blueberry muffin if they were fresh. "Good morning, sweetheart," Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had spent 40 years teaching third graders. "Looks like it's going to be another beautiful day." Sarah smiled warmly, already reaching for a medium cup and moving toward the coffee dispensers. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson. I just pulled a fresh batch of blueberry muffins from the oven about 20 minutes ago. Still warm if you'd like one." "You know me too well, dear." The elderly woman settled into her usual spot at the small round table near the window, where she could watch the morning commute begin to pick up pace along Main Street. "How's that garden of yours coming along? Last time we talked, you were having trouble with those tomatoes." As Sarah prepared the coffee, she found herself falling into the comfortable pattern of small talk that had become such a central part of her daily routine. She genuinely enjoyed hearing about her customers' lives, their small victories, and everyday challenges. It was a stark contrast to the life she had lived before, where conversations were often coded, urgent, and carried life-or-death implications. "The tomatoes are finally starting to come around," Sarah replied, adding the precise amount of cream and sugar that Mrs. Henderson preferred. "I think it was a soil drainage issue. I added some sand and compost, and they're looking much healthier now." The truth was, gardening had become one of Sarah's greatest sources of joy and therapy. There was something deeply satisfying about nurturing something from seed to harvest, about working with her hands in the earth, and watching life grow under her care. It was honest work, straightforward, and uncomplicated in a way that her previous career had never been. More customers began filtering in as the morning rush hour approached. There was Tom Bradley, the bank manager who always ordered a large black coffee and read the financial section of the newspaper at the corner booth. Jennifer Walsh, a young mother of 3 who worked part-time at the local real estate office, came in looking slightly frazzled as usual, ordering an extra-large vanilla latte with an extra shot of espresso to help her get through another busy day. Then, There was David Park, a recent college graduate who had moved to Cedar Falls to work as a reporter for the local newspaper. He was earnest and enthusiastic about his work, often spending hours at the cafe with his laptop, working on articles about town council meetings and high school sports games. Sarah had grown fond of his genuine curiosity about the community and his determination to tell stories that mattered to the people of Cedar Falls. "Morning, Sarah," David called out as he approached the counter, his messenger bag slung over one shoulder and his hair still showing signs of having been hastily combed. "Could I get my usual, and maybe one of those chocolate croissants? I skipped breakfast again. Large coffee with oat milk and a chocolate croissant." "Coming right up," Sarah replied, shaking her head with mock disapproval. "You really need to start eating a proper breakfast, David. Your body needs fuel, especially with all the running around you do for the paper." I know. My mom tells me the same thing every time we talk." David grinned and pulled out his wallet. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something. I'm working on a feature story about local business owners who moved here from somewhere else. You know, people who chose Cedar Falls as their home rather than being born here. Would you be interested in being interviewed? I think people would love to hear about why you decided to open a cafe here." Sarah's hand paused for just a fraction of a second as she reached for the oat milk. But she quickly recovered and continued preparing his drink. This was the kind of attention she had always been careful to avoid. Not because she had anything to hide from the good people of Cedar Falls, but because her story was complicated in ways that she couldn't easily explain without revealing things that were better left buried. "That's really sweet of you to think of me, David, but I'm probably not the most interesting subject for a story like that," she replied carefully, keeping her tone light and conversational. "I came here. I opened a coffee shop. I fell in love with the community. Not exactly front-page material." "Are you kidding? You're being way too modest. I've heard bits and pieces over the years. You were in the military before this, right? Air Force. And you traveled all over the world before settling down here. That's exactly the kind of story people want to read." Sarah handed him his coffee and croissant, forcing a smile even as she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always came when people started asking too many questions about her past. "Maybe someday, David. Right now I'm just focused on keeping this place running and serving good coffee to good people." She could see that he wanted to press the issue further, but the morning rush was starting in earnest now, and a line was beginning to form behind him. David took the hint and found his usual table, though Sarah could feel his curious gaze on her from time to time as she worked. The next few hours passed in the familiar blur of taking orders, making drinks, and engaging in brief conversations with a steady stream of customers. There was something almost meditative about the work. The physical tasks required just enough attention to keep her hands busy while allowing her mind to wander, but not so much concentration that she couldn't engage with the people who came through her doors. Around mid-morning, during a brief lull between the breakfast rush and the coffee break crowd, Sarah found herself thinking about David's question. It wasn't the first time someone had expressed curiosity about her background. In a small town, newcomers were always subjects of interest, and she had been answering variations of the same questions for 12 years. She had developed a standard set of responses that were truthful but vague, satisfying people's curiosity without revealing anything significant. The reality was that her military service had been unlike anything most people would imagine when they heard the words Air Force. She hadn't been a mechanic or an administrator or even a pilot in the traditional sense that most people understood the term. Her role had been highly specialized, highly classified, and had taken her to places and situations that officially didn't exist in any public records. For 8 years, she had been part of a select group of individuals who operated in the gray areas between traditional military operations and intelligence gathering. Her call sign, Phoenix, had been earned during her 3rd deployment, when she had successfully completed a mission that everyone else had assumed was hopeless. She had gone in when conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done, and she had come out when everyone expected her to be lost. But those days were behind her now. She had made a conscious choice to leave that life behind when her last tour of duty ended. She had served her country with distinction, had done things she was proud of, and things that still sometimes kept her awake at night. And She had earned the right to a quiet life, doing honest work in a place where the biggest crisis was running out of cinnamon rolls on a busy Saturday morning. The bell above the door chimed again, and Sarah looked up to see a face she didn't recognize. The man was probably in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of upright posture that suggested military training, even though he was dressed in civilian clothes. He wore a simple navy blue polo shirt and khaki pants, but there was something about the way he carried himself that immediately caught her attention. He approached the counter with measured steps, his eyes scanning the menu board above Sarah's head before settling on her face. When he spoke, his voice had the clear, precise diction of someone accustomed to giving orders and being understood the first time. "Good morning. Could I get a large black coffee, no sugar?" "Of course," Sarah replied, turning toward the coffee dispensers. "For here or to go?" "For here, please." As she prepared his drink, Sarah found herself studying the man more closely in her peripheral vision. There was something familiar about him, though she was certain they had never met. It was more a sense of recognition based on type rather than individual identity. He had the bearing and mannerisms of career military, probably an officer, and probably one who had held significant responsibility. "Beautiful place you have here," he said conversationally as she handed him the coffee. "How long have you been in business?" "About 12 years now," Sarah replied. "I bought the building when I moved to Cedar Falls and converted it into the cafe. It's been a labor of love." The man nodded approvingly as he looked around the space, taking in the exposed brick walls, the original hardwood floors, and the carefully chosen vintage furniture that gave the place its warm, welcoming atmosphere. "You've done excellent work. It has a very comfortable feel to it." He paid for his coffee and chose a table near the back of the cafe, settling in with a view of both the front door and the counter where Sarah worked. It was a position that would allow him to observe everything happening in the space while maintaining a low profile himself. Again, Sarah noted this detail with the part of her mind that had been trained to notice such things, even as she tried to dismiss it as coincidence. The lunch crowd began filtering in around 11:30, bringing with it the usual collection of construction workers, office employees, and retired folks looking for a good sandwich and a place to socialize. Sarah had hired 2 part-time employees to help during busy periods, but she still preferred to work the counter herself whenever possible. It allowed her to maintain the personal connections with customers that were such an important part of what made Sunrise Cafe special. Throughout the lunch rush, she noticed that the military-looking gentleman remained at his table, occasionally sipping his coffee and reading what appeared to be official documents from a leather briefcase. He ordered a turkey sandwich when the lunch menu became available, and politely declined her offer of chips or a side salad. Everything about his behavior suggested someone who was accustomed to efficiency and simplicity. As the afternoon wore on and the cafe began to empty out, Sarah found herself growing increasingly curious about her mysterious customer. He had been there for nearly 4 hours, which was unusual even by the standards of Cedar Falls, where people often used the cafe as an informal office or meeting place. His presence wasn't disruptive or problematic in any way, but there was something about the situation that triggered her old instincts. Around 3 o'clock, when only a handful of customers remained in the cafe, the man approached the counter again. Sarah looked up from the inventory sheet she had been updating and smiled politely. "Can I get you anything else? Another coffee, maybe?" "Actually, I was hoping I could have a word with you privately," he said quietly. "My name is Admiral James Richardson, United States Navy. I believe we need to talk." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, even though his tone remained calm and conversational. The use of his rank, the suggestion that they needed to talk privately, and, most importantly, the implication that he knew who she was, all combined to send a surge of adrenaline through her system that she hadn't felt in over a decade. "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied carefully, keeping her voice steady even as her mind raced through possibilities and potential responses. "I think you might have me confused with someone else." Admiral Richardson smiled slightly, but his eyes remained serious. "I don't think so, Phoenix." The sound of her old call sign spoken aloud in her cafe, in the middle of the quiet life she had built so carefully, was like hearing her own voice echoing back from another lifetime. Sarah felt the familiar hyper-awareness that had once been essential to her survival beginning to sharpen her senses. She could hear David typing on his laptop in the corner, could smell the lingering aroma of the soup she had prepared that morning, could feel the weight of the towel in her hands that she had been unconsciously twisting as they spoke. "I close at 6, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk then?" "Of course. I'll wait." The final 3 hours of that Tuesday felt like an eternity. Sarah went through the motions of running her cafe, serving the remaining customers, cleaning equipment, and preparing for closing, but her mind was elsewhere. Every few minutes, her eyes would drift to the back table where Admiral Richardson sat calmly reading his documents, as if he hadn't just dropped a bombshell that threatened to upend everything she had built over the past 12 years. As 6 o'clock approached, Sarah found herself moving with the mechanical precision that had once characterized her military bearing. She counted the day's receipts with extra care, double-checked that all the equipment was properly cleaned and secured, and made sure the front door was locked and the closed sign was clearly visible. The familiar routines helped keep her hands steady and her breathing even, but they couldn't quiet the storm of questions and memories that Admiral Richardson's presence had unleashed. When she finally turned back toward the dining area, she found him sitting patiently, his briefcase closed and his hands folded on the table in front of him. Despite the gravity of the situation, there was something reassuring about his calm demeanor. He wasn't displaying the urgency or tension that would suggest an immediate crisis, which helped ease some of Sarah's anxiety about what this conversation might bring. "Would you like some fresh coffee?" she asked, falling back on the hospitality habits that had become second nature to her. "I was about to make a pot for myself anyway." "That would be very kind, thank you." Sarah busied herself with preparing a fresh pot, grateful for the familiar task that gave her a few more minutes to gather her thoughts. As the coffee brewed, she pulled 2 mugs from the shelf and arranged them on a small tray along with cream and sugar, even though she remembered that Admiral Richardson took his coffee black. She brought the tray to his table and settled into the chair across from him, pouring coffee for both of them with hands that were steadier than she had expected. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken history hanging between them like fog. "How did you find me?" Sarah asked finally, her voice quiet but direct. Admiral Richardson added a small amount of cream to his coffee, stirring it slowly as he considered his response. "It took longer than you might think. You did an excellent job of disappearing when you left the service. Your separation paperwork was processed through normal channels. Your benefits were transferred to standard veteran programs. And, for all official purposes, you simply became another former service member starting a new life as a civilian." He paused to take a sip of his coffee before continuing. "But certain operations leave traces, even classified ones. About 6 months ago, we were conducting a routine review of personnel records from your old unit, and your name came up in connection with some documentation that was being declassified. Nothing dramatic or urgent, just administrative housekeeping. But it made me curious about what had become of some of the people who had served in those specialized roles." Sarah felt a familiar chill at the mention of declassification. Even after all these years, the idea that any aspect of her former work might become public knowledge was deeply unsettling. What kind of documentation? Training records, mostly. Equipment requisitions. Personnel evaluations. Nothing operational, and certainly nothing that would compromise security or reveal classified details. But enough to remind me of the exceptional work that people like you did during some very difficult years. The Admiral's tone was matter of fact, but Sarah could hear the underlying respect and appreciation in his words. It was the kind of recognition that she had never received publicly, could never receive publicly, for work that officially had never happened. "I started making some discreet inquiries," Admiral Richardson continued. "Not through official channels, you understand. Just personal curiosity about people I had come to respect. Most of your former colleagues have remained in similar lines of work, though in different capacities. Some went to intelligence agencies, others to private security firms, a few to government contractors. But you seem to have vanished completely." Sarah couldn't help but smile slightly at that. The ability to disappear had been one of the skills she had developed during her military service, though she had never expected to use it to hide from her own government. "I wanted a clean break. No connections to the old life, No ongoing obligations or associations. Just a chance to be a normal person doing normal things. And you've succeeded admirably. Sarah Martinez, small business owner, pillar of the Cedar Falls community, known for her excellent coffee and her involvement in local charities. You've built a good life here. The Admiral's words carried no judgment or criticism, but Sarah felt compelled to explain herself anyway. I served my country for 8 years. I did my job, and I did it well. But that life came with a cost, and eventually, I decided I had paid enough. I earned the right to walk away. You absolutely did. Admiral Richardson agreed without hesitation. And I want to be clear that I'm not here to ask you to come back to any kind of active service. Your military career is over, and that's your choice to make. But there's something you need to know about the work you did, particularly regarding Operation Silent Phoenix. The mention of that specific operation name sent a jolt through Sarah's system. Operation Silent Phoenix had been her last and most challenging assignment, a mission so deeply classified that even most of the people involved had been given only partial information about the overall objectives. It was the operation that had earned her the call sign Phoenix, and it was the operation that had ultimately convinced her to leave military service behind. What about it? She asked carefully. Admiral Richardson opened his briefcase and extracted a thick folder marked with classification stamps and security warnings. Before I show you this, I need you to understand that what I'm about to share with you has been declassified specifically for this conversation. The decision to reveal this information was made at the highest levels of government, and it comes with certain official recognition that is long overdue. He slid the folder across the table towards Sarah, but kept his hand on it for a moment. Operation Silent Phoenix was a success, Sarah. A complete, unqualified success. The intelligence you gathered and the assets you secured prevented what would have been a catastrophic terrorist attack on American soil. We're talking about something that could have killed thousands of people and fundamentally changed the course of American foreign policy. Sarah stared at the folder without touching it. For 15 years, she had lived with the assumption that Operation Silent Phoenix had been at best a partial success, and, at worst, a complete failure. The mission had been aborted before she could complete all of her objectives, and she had extracted with only some of the intelligence she had been sent to gather. The official debriefing had been brief and vague, with her commanding officers thanking her for her service but providing no details about the ultimate outcome of her work. I don't understand, she said slowly. The mission was cut short. I didn't complete the full objectives. The extraction was rushed, and I had to leave critical intelligence behind. The intelligence you did gather was more than sufficient, Admiral Richardson replied. In fact, it was exactly what we needed to understand the scope and timeline of the threat we were facing. The decision to abort the mission early wasn't made because of any failure on your part, but because the intelligence you had already transmitted was so critical that getting you out safely became the top priority. He opened the folder and revealed the first page of what appeared to be a comprehensive after-action report. The document was heavily redacted, with large blocks of text blacked out, but Sarah could see her call sign mentioned repeatedly throughout the visible portions. The terrorist cell you were monitoring was planning to detonate a radiological dispersion device in downtown Chicago during the NATO summit in 2009, Admiral Richardson continued. They had acquired the materials, they had developed the technical capability, and they had identified their target. Without the intelligence you provided, we would never have been able to identify and neutralize the threat before the summit began. Sarah felt the room spinning slightly as she tried to process this information. She remembered the mission clearly, remembered the weeks of preparation and the months of deep cover work to infiltrate the organization she had been assigned to monitor. She remembered the crushing disappointment when the mission had been aborted just as she was getting close to the most critical intelligence targets. But the extraction, she said weakly. It was so sudden. I thought something had gone wrong. Something had gone right, Admiral Richardson corrected gently. Your intelligence had given us what we needed to act. The extraction was sudden because every hour you remained in place increased the risk of exposure, and, by that point, your safety was more important than any additional intelligence you might have gathered. He turned several pages in the folder, revealing photographs and documents that Sarah recognized from her time undercover. Seeing them again after so many years brought back a flood of memories, both of the intense focus required for the work and of the psychological toll that such deep cover assignments inevitably took. The terrorist cell was rounded up in coordinated raids across 3 countries, Admiral Richardson continued. The radiological materials were secured, the device components were confiscated, and the threat was completely eliminated. The NATO summit proceeded without incident, and thousands of innocent people went about their lives never knowing how close they had come to disaster. Sarah picked up the folder with trembling hands and began reading through the visible portions of the after-action report. The language was dry and clinical, as military reports always were, but the implications were staggering. Charts and graphs showed the potential casualty estimates if the attack had succeeded, the economic impact it would have had on the city of Chicago and the broader region, and the geopolitical consequences that would have followed. "Why wasn't I told?" she asked, looking up from the documents. "Why did I spend 15 years thinking that the mission had been a failure?" "Because that's how these operations work," Admiral Richardson replied sadly. "The people who do the most critical work often never get to see the results of their efforts. Operational security requires that information be compartmentalized, and by the time it was safe to reveal the full scope of what had been accomplished, you had already left the service and disappeared." He paused to take another sip of his coffee before continuing. "But, more importantly, there was a decision made at the time to keep the entire operation classified indefinitely. The intelligence community felt that revealing the existence of the threat, even after it had been neutralized, could inspire copycat attacks or reveal too much about our detection and response capabilities." Sarah continued reading through the folder, her eyes scanning charts showing the organizational structure of the terrorist cell, maps indicating the locations where arrests had been made, and intelligence assessments describing the sophisticated level of planning that had gone into the attack. The scope of what she had helped prevent was far beyond anything she had imagined during the mission itself. "There's something else," Admiral Richardson said quietly. He reached into his briefcase again and withdrew a small wooden box with an official seal on the top. The decision to declassify this information wasn't made just to satisfy historical curiosity. It was made because certain people felt that you deserved to be recognized for what you accomplished. He slid the box across the table towards Sarah with the same careful deliberation he had used with the folder. Inside that box is the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest honors that can be awarded for extraordinary heroism in action against an enemy of the United States. It was approved for you 15 years ago, immediately after Operation Silent Phoenix was completed, but it couldn't be presented because the operation itself was too classified to acknowledge. Sarah stared at the box without touching it, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of everything she was learning. The Distinguished Service Cross was an award she had never even dreamed of receiving, reserved for acts of exceptional courage and effectiveness in combat situations. "The classification restrictions have now been partially lifted," Admiral Richardson continued. "Not enough to make any of this public knowledge, but enough to allow for private recognition of your service. If you choose to accept it, the award ceremony will be small and discreet, attended only by a few senior officials who were involved in the operation." She finally reached out and opened the box, revealing the distinctive cross-shaped metal nestled in blue satin. The bronze cross bore the words "For Valor" and was suspended from a ribbon of red, white, and blue stripes. It was beautiful and meaningful in a way that brought tears to her eyes. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Admiral Richardson replied gently. "You earned this 15 years ago. The only question is whether you want to accept it now." Sarah closed the box and held it in her hands, feeling the weight of both the physical object and everything it represented. For so many years, she had carried the burden of believing that her last mission had been incomplete, that she had somehow failed to live up to the standards she had set for herself throughout her military career. Learning that the opposite was true, that her work had been not just successful but critically important, was almost too much to process. "Can I think about it?" she asked finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be in town for a few more days, staying at the Mountain View Inn. You can reach me there whenever you're ready to talk." Admiral Richardson stood up and gathered his materials, returning everything to his briefcase with the same methodical precision he had displayed throughout their conversation. As he prepared to leave, he paused and looked directly at Sarah. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think you made the right choice in leaving when you did. That kind of work isn't sustainable indefinitely, and you clearly found something here that gives your life meaning and purpose. But you should know that your service mattered, and that the sacrifices you made protected people who will never even know your name." After he left, Sarah sat alone in her empty cafe, staring at the wooden box and the folder full of declassified documents. The familiar space suddenly felt different, as if the revelation of her past had somehow altered the fundamental nature of her present. She thought about all the customers she had served over the years, all the conversations she had had about ordinary things like weather and gardening and local gossip, and realized that she had been serving them in more ways than they could ever know. She had protected them once, 15 years ago, from a threat they had never been aware of. And now she was protecting them again, in a different way, by providing a space where they could gather and connect and feel part of a community. Both forms of service were valuable, both were necessary, and both had given her life purpose and meaning. As she sat in the gathering darkness, Sarah began to understand that accepting the Distinguished Service Cross wouldn't just be about receiving recognition for past achievements. It would also be about reconciling the two halves of her life, acknowledging that the woman who had risked everything to prevent a terrorist attack and the woman who made coffee for her neighbors every morning were the same person, and that both versions of herself deserved respect and recognition. Sarah spent the night walking through her small apartment above the cafe, unable to sleep as her mind processed everything Admiral Richardson had revealed. The wooden box containing the Distinguished Service Cross sat on her kitchen table, opened and closed repeatedly as she struggled with the decision of whether to accept the recognition she had never expected to receive. By dawn, she had made multiple pots of tea, reorganized her already tidy living space twice, and stood at her bedroom window watching the sun rise over the mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls. The peaceful beauty of the scene was a stark contrast to the turmoil in her mind, but it also reminded her of why she had chosen this place as her refuge from a more complicated world. She opened the cafe as usual that Wednesday morning, going through the familiar routines of preparing for another day of business. But everything felt different now, colored by the knowledge that her carefully constructed ordinary life had been built on foundations that were anything but ordinary. Every interaction with customers, every casual conversation about daily concerns, carried new weight as she found herself seeing her neighbors through the lens of someone who had once risked everything to protect people just like them. Mrs. Henderson arrived at her usual time, settling into her regular table with her coffee and blueberry muffin. But today, instead of their typical exchange of pleasantries about gardening and weather, Sarah found herself really studying the elderly woman's face, thinking about how Mrs. Henderson represented thousands of people who had been allowed to live their normal lives because of missions like Operation Silent Phoenix. "You seem a bit distracted today, dear," Mrs. Henderson observed with the perceptive eye of someone who had spent decades working with children. "Everything all right?" Sarah forced a smile and busied herself wiping down the already clean counter. "Just thinking about some business decisions I need to make. Nothing too serious." It wasn't entirely untrue, though the business decision in question was unlike anything Mrs. Henderson could probably imagine. How do you explain to someone that you're trying to decide whether to accept a military decoration for preventing a terrorist attack that no one was supposed to know about? The morning rush proceeded normally, with the usual collection of regulars stopping by for their coffee and brief social interactions before heading off to work. Tom Bradley discussed the latest changes in interest rates. Jennifer Walsh shared stories about her children's summer activities, and David Park mentioned that he was working on a follow-up story to his feature about local business owners who had moved to Cedar Falls from elsewhere. "Still hoping to convince you to let me interview you," David said as Sarah prepared his usual order. "I've been thinking about it more, and I really think your story would inspire people. Military veteran who found peace and purpose in small-town life, building something meaningful from scratch. It's exactly the kind of positive story people need to hear these days." Sarah's hand paused as she reached for the oat milk, the irony of David's words hitting her with unexpected force. If only he knew just how inspiring and positive her actual story was, and how impossible it would be for her to share it with him or anyone else. I appreciate the interest, David, really I do. But I'm just not comfortable being the subject of a newspaper article. Some people prefer to keep their lives private, you know? David nodded, though Sarah could see the journalist's curiosity still burning in his eyes. I understand. But if you ever change your mind, the offer stands. Around mid-morning, Sarah noticed Admiral Richardson entering the cafe. He was dressed similarly to the previous day, in civilian clothes that somehow still managed to suggest military bearing. He approached the counter with the same measured steps and polite demeanor, but Sarah could see a hint of expectation in his expression. "Good morning," he said simply. "Large black coffee, no sugar, if you please." "Coming right up," Sarah replied, grateful that the cafe was relatively quiet and they could speak without being overheard by other customers. As she prepared his coffee, Admiral Richardson settled at the same table he had occupied the previous day. When Sarah brought his drink over, he gestured to the chair across from him in silent invitation. "I've been thinking about what we discussed yesterday," Sarah said quietly as she sat down. "About the recognition, about accepting the medal. I'm still not sure what the right decision is." Admiral Richardson nodded understandingly. "It's not an easy choice. Accepting military honors means acknowledging a part of your life that you've worked very hard to leave behind. I understand the conflict that creates." Sarah appreciated that he didn't try to pressure her or make the decision seem simpler than it was. The weight of her internal struggle was real, and his recognition of that fact made her feel more comfortable discussing her concerns. "I've built a good life here," she continued. "The people in this community know me as Sarah the cafe owner, not as Phoenix the special operations soldier. I like that simplicity. I like being able to wake up every morning and know that my biggest worry is whether I have enough pastries for the lunch rush. And there's nothing wrong with wanting that kind of peace," Admiral Richardson assured her. "You earn the right to a quiet life. The question is whether accepting recognition for your past service would necessarily threaten the life you've built in the present." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the mid-morning customers come and go. Sarah found herself observing her neighbors with new eyes, seeing them not just as individuals, but as representatives of the society she had once sworn to protect and defend. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said eventually. "How many people know about Operation Silent Phoenix? I mean, how many people in government are aware of what actually happened?" Admiral Richardson considered the question carefully. At the time of the operation, perhaps a dozen people had complete knowledge of the objectives and outcomes. Some of those individuals have since retired or passed away, and others have moved to different positions where the information is no longer relevant to their duties. Today, I would estimate that fewer than 6 people in active government service have access to the complete classified record. And the terrorists who were arrested? What happened to them? They were prosecuted under existing anti-terrorism statutes, but the specific plot they were involved in was never revealed publicly. As far as the public record is concerned, they were convicted of conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The radiological aspect of their plan was never disclosed. Sarah found this information both reassuring and troubling. On one hand, it meant that the threat had been completely neutralized without creating public panic or revealing sensitive intelligence capabilities. On the other hand, it meant that the full scope of what she had helped prevent would never be publicly acknowledged or understood. "What about the awards ceremony you mentioned?" she asked. "If I decided to accept the medal, who would be there?" "Myself, obviously, as the presenting officer. The current Secretary of Defense has expressed interest in attending, along with 1 or 2 senior officials from the intelligence community who were involved in the original operation. We're talking about perhaps 4 or 5 people total, and all of them already have complete knowledge of your service record." The intimate scale of the proposed ceremony was both appealing and daunting. It would allow for genuine recognition without compromising her privacy or security, but it would also force her to confront memories and emotions that she had spent years learning to manage. "Would there be any kind of official record of the award?" Sarah asked. "Something that would become part of my permanent military file or be accessible through Freedom of Information Act requests?" The award itself would be added to your classified service record, which is not subject to FOIA requests. There would be no public documentation of any kind. As far as official records are concerned, it would be as if the ceremony never happened. This assurance helped ease some of Sarah's concerns about potential exposure, but it also raised philosophical questions about the nature of recognition and honor. What did it mean to receive an award if no one outside a small circle of government officials would ever know about it? I keep thinking about something you said yesterday, Sarah admitted, about how the people who do the most critical work often never get to see the results of their efforts. I've made my peace with that, I think. I've found other ways to feel useful and purposeful. But there's a part of me that wonders if accepting this recognition would somehow cheapen the work I'm doing now. Admiral Richardson shook his head firmly. Nothing could cheapen the work you're doing now. Building a successful business, contributing to your community, providing a gathering place where people can connect with each other. These are all valuable forms of service. They're different from military service, but they're no less important. He paused to take a sip of his coffee before continuing. But I would argue that accepting recognition for your military service wouldn't diminish your civilian achievements. If anything, it might help you understand that both aspects of your life are part of the same continuum of service to others. Sarah found this perspective compelling, but wasn't entirely convinced. The two halves of her life had always seemed fundamentally different to her, requiring different skills and serving different purposes. The idea that they might be connected in some deeper way was intriguing, but also unsettling. "Can I tell you what I'm really afraid of?" she said after a long pause. "I'm afraid that accepting the medal will change how I think about myself. Right now, I can wake up every morning and be genuinely happy about making coffee and talking to my neighbors about ordinary things. I'm afraid that if I start thinking of myself as someone who prevented a terrorist attack, I'll lose the ability to find satisfaction in simple pleasures." Admiral Richardson leaned back in his chair, considering her words carefully. "That's a very honest concern, and I think it shows remarkable self-awareness. But I wonder if you're giving yourself enough credit for your ability to hold both truths simultaneously." "What do you mean?" "You've been both people all along, Sarah. The woman who prevented a terrorist attack and the woman who makes excellent coffee haven't been separate individuals. They've been the same person at different stages of life. You didn't stop being heroic when you left the military. You just found a different way to express the same fundamental qualities that made you effective as a special operations soldier." Sarah considered this perspective as she watched David Park typing on his laptop in the corner of the cafe. He was working on stories that mattered to the people of Cedar Falls, using his skills and talents to serve his community in the way that felt most meaningful to him. In some ways, his work and her work weren't so different, even though the scales and contexts were completely different. "What would happen if I decided not to accept the medal?" she asked. "Would it just go back into some classified file and be forgotten again?" "The medal would be returned to secured storage, and your service record would note that recognition was offered but declined. There would be no negative consequences or judgment. The decision has to be yours, and yours alone." Sarah appreciated having the option to decline without facing pressure or criticism. It made the choice feel more genuine and less like she was being manipulated into a predetermined outcome. They were interrupted by the arrival of the lunch crowd, and Admiral Richardson graciously excused himself to allow Sarah to focus on her customers. As she worked through the busy period, preparing sandwiches and salads and engaging in brief conversations with the people who had become such an important part of her daily life, she found herself thinking about the connection between different types of service. Tom Bradley mentioned that his bank was planning to sponsor a scholarship program for local students, using bank profits to invest in the community's future. Jennifer Walsh talked about organizing a fundraiser for a family whose house had been damaged in a recent storm, mobilizing her neighbors to help people in need. Even Mrs. Henderson, in her retirement, volunteered at the local library and helped organize reading programs for children. Everyone in her cafe, in their own way, was contributing to something larger than themselves. They were all finding ways to use their skills and resources to make their corner of the world a little better, a little safer, a little more connected. Sarah began to realize that Admiral Richardson might be right about the continuity between her military service and her civilian life. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself making mental lists of the pros and cons of accepting the Distinguished Service Cross. On one side was her desire for privacy, her fear of complicating her simple life, and her concern about how the recognition might affect her sense of identity. On the other side was the opportunity to honor the work she had done, to acknowledge the sacrifices she had made, and to find closure on a chapter of her life that had been left incomplete. But, perhaps most importantly, she began to think about what the decision would mean for other people who had served in similar capacities. How many former Special Operations soldiers were living quietly in small towns across America, carrying classified memories of work that had protected their fellow citizens. How many of them had never received recognition for their sacrifices, not because their work wasn't valuable, but because the nature of that work made public acknowledgement impossible. If she accepted the Distinguished Service Cross, she would be accepting it not just for herself, but as a representative of all the people who had served in the shadows, who had put their lives at risk for missions that would never be publicly celebrated. That responsibility felt both humbling and inspiring. As closing time approached, Sarah realized that she had made her decision. It hadn't been a sudden moment of clarity, but rather a gradual understanding that accepting recognition for her past service was compatible with embracing her present life. She could be proud of what she had accomplished as Phoenix while continuing to find fulfillment in what she was building as Sarah. Sarah called Admiral Richardson that evening from her apartment above the cafe, her decision finally crystallized after hours of internal debate. The phone rang twice before his familiar, measured voice answered. Admiral Richardson speaking. Admiral, this is Sarah Martinez. I've made my decision about the medal. She took a deep breath, feeling a strange mixture of nervousness and relief. I would like to accept the Distinguished Service Cross. There was a brief pause before Admiral Richardson responded, and Sarah could hear the genuine warmth in his voice when he did. I'm very pleased to hear that, Sarah. I believe it's the right decision, and I know that the other officials who will be attending the ceremony will be honored to finally meet you in person. They spent the next few minutes discussing the practical details of the award ceremony. It would take place the following Friday at 2 p.m. in a private conference room at the Mountain View Inn, the same hotel where Admiral Richardson was staying. The location had been chosen specifically because it was neutral, secure, and wouldn't require Sarah to travel far from her business. Is there anything special I need to do to prepare? Sarah asked, suddenly, aware that she hadn't attended any kind of military ceremony in over a decade. Just be yourself, Admiral Richardson replied. This isn't a formal military parade. It's a small gathering of people who want to recognize your exceptional service. Dress however you feel comfortable. After hanging up the phone, Sarah stood in her kitchen looking out at the lights of Cedar Falls below her window. The town looked so peaceful and ordinary from this perspective, a collection of homes and businesses where people lived their quiet lives without any awareness of the dangers that existed in the wider world. Tomorrow, she would open her cafe as usual and serve coffee to her neighbors, but on Friday, she would step back into her role as Phoenix long enough to receive recognition for work that had helped keep all of those lights burning safely. The next few days passed in a blur of normal routine, punctuated by moments of surreal anticipation. Sarah found herself paying closer attention to her interactions with customers, wondering if any of them would notice subtle changes in her demeanor or energy. But if anyone detected anything different about her, they were polite enough not to mention it. David Park stopped by on Thursday morning with his usual enthusiasm about potential story ideas. I've been thinking more about that feature story on local business owners, he said as Sarah prepared his coffee. I know you said you weren't interested, but I've been talking to some other people in town, and your name keeps coming up as someone who's made a real difference in the community. Sarah smiled at the irony of his words, knowing that she had made a difference in ways that David couldn't imagine and could never report. That's very flattering, David, but I really prefer to keep a low profile. Some of us are just meant to work behind the scenes. Behind the scenes can be just as important as front and center, David replied thoughtfully. Sometimes the people doing the most important work are the ones nobody notices. His words stayed with Sarah throughout the morning, serving as an unexpected validation of the decision she had made to accept the Distinguished Service Cross. Whether he knew it or not, David had articulated something essential about the nature of service and recognition. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp mountain air that made Cedar Falls such a beautiful place to live. Sarah opened the cafe as usual, but she had arranged for her 2 part-time employees to cover the afternoon shift so she could attend the ceremony. She told them she had an important meeting with a potential supplier, which was technically true if vague about the actual nature of the meeting. The morning passed quietly, with fewer customers than usual due to several local events that were drawing people away from their normal routines. Sarah found herself grateful for the reduced pace, which allowed her to focus on the ceremony ahead without the distraction of a busy cafe. Around noon, she went upstairs to change clothes and prepare for the most significant military event she had attended since her discharge ceremony 15 years earlier. After considerable deliberation, she had chosen a simple navy blue dress that was professional but not overly formal, paired with low heels and minimal jewelry. The outfit struck the right balance between respecting the solemnity of the occasion and maintaining the civilian identity she had worked so hard to establish. As she prepared to leave for the Mountain View Inn, Sarah took one last look around her apartment. Everything was exactly as she had left it that morning, but somehow the space felt different, as if it were being viewed through new eyes. This was still her home, and the cafe downstairs was still her business. But, in a few hours, both would exist within the context of a more complete understanding of who she was and what she had accomplished. The drive to the Mountain View Inn took only 10 minutes, but Sarah found herself taking a longer route through the residential neighborhoods of Cedar Falls, wanting to see the place that had become her sanctuary through the lens of everything she now knew about her past service. The houses looked the same as they always had, but she found herself thinking about the families inside them, about the children playing in the yards, and the parents working to build good lives for their families. These were the people she had protected, she realized. Not abstract statistics or policy considerations, but real individuals with names and dreams and daily concerns about mundane things like homework and grocery shopping and saving for vacation. The scope of what Operation Silent Phoenix had prevented became more real and meaningful when she thought about it in terms of specific lives rather than general casualties. The Mountain View Inn was a modest but well-maintained hotel that catered primarily to business travelers and tourists visiting the nearby national park. Sarah had eaten in their restaurant a few times over the years, but had never had reason to visit their conference facilities. The desk clerk directed her to Conference Room B, located down a hallway that was decorated with landscape photographs of the local mountains. Admiral Richardson was waiting outside the conference room when she arrived, dressed in his formal Navy uniform for the first time since she had met him. The sight of the uniform, with its rows of ribbons and insignia marking years of distinguished service, reminded Sarah of the weight and tradition behind the ceremony she was about to experience. "You look very nice," Admiral Richardson said with a warm smile as he shook her hand. "Are you ready for this?" "I think so," Sarah replied honestly. "I'm nervous, but in a good way, if that makes sense." "Perfect sense. The best ceremonies usually involve some nervous energy." Admiral Richardson opened the door to the conference room, and Sarah stepped inside to find 3 other people waiting for her. The room itself was simple but elegant, with a long wooden table surrounded by leather chairs and windows that looked out onto the hotel's garden. The first person Admiral Richardson introduced was Secretary of Defense Patricia Williams, a distinguished woman in her late 50s who wore her civilian suit with the same authority that Admiral Richardson wore his uniform. She greeted Sarah with a firm handshake and direct eye contact that conveyed both respect and genuine appreciation. "Ms. Martinez, it's an honor to finally meet you," Secretary Williams said. "I've read your service record multiple times over the years, and I want you to know that what you accomplished during Operation Silent Phoenix represents the very best of American military service." The second introduction was to Director Michael Chun from the Defense Intelligence Agency, a quietly intense man who had been involved in the planning and coordination of Operation Silent Phoenix from the intelligence side. His greeting was more reserved, but no less sincere. "Phoenix," he said simply, using her old call sign. "It's good to see you again, even under these circumstances." Sarah was surprised to realize that she remembered Director Chun from some of the pre-mission briefings, though he had been much younger then and held a different position. The recognition created an unexpected connection to that earlier phase of her life. The final introduction was to General Robert Hayes, who had been Admiral Richardson's counterpart in the Army during the time of Operation Silent Phoenix. He was now retired, but had been involved in the decision to declassify certain aspects of the operation and offer recognition to the personnel involved. Sergeant Martinez, General Hayes said formally, then smiled and continued in a more casual tone. Or should I say, Ms. Martinez, we've been wanting to do this for a very long time. The ceremony itself was surprisingly intimate and personal. Rather than the rigid formality Sarah had expected, the atmosphere was more like a reunion of colleagues who shared important history. Admiral Richardson served as the official presenter, but each of the other attendees took turns sharing their perspectives on Operation Silent Phoenix and the impact it had made on national security. Secretary Williams spoke about the broader strategic implications of preventing the Chicago attack, explaining how the successful disruption of the terrorist plot had helped maintain public confidence in large international gatherings and prevented the kind of policy overreactions that often followed successful attacks. Director Chun provided more operational context, describing how the intelligence Sarah had gathered had been used to identify and neutralize similar threats in other countries, ultimately disrupting an entire network of terrorist cells that had been planning coordinated attacks across multiple continents. General Hayes talked about the evolution of special operations since the time of Operation Silent Phoenix, crediting missions like Sarah's with helping to refine the techniques and approaches that were now standard practice for similar threats. When Admiral Richardson finally called Sarah forward to receive the Distinguished Service Cross, the moment felt both surreal and deeply meaningful. She stood at attention as he read the official citation, which described her actions in general terms that captured the essence of what she had accomplished without revealing specific operational details. For extraordinary heroism in action against an enemy of the United States, Admiral Richardson read in his clear, formal voice. Sergeant Martinez demonstrated exceptional courage and professionalism in conducting a deep-cover intelligence operation under extremely dangerous conditions. Her actions directly contributed to the prevention of a catastrophic terrorist attack that would have resulted in massive civilian casualties and threatened national security. Her dedication to duty and willingness to risk her life in service of her country represent the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon herself, the United States Air Force, and the United States of America. As Admiral Richardson placed the medal around Sarah's neck, she felt a complex mixture of emotions that were difficult to separate and analyze. There was pride, certainly, and relief at finally receiving recognition for work that had defined such an important period of her life. But there was also a sense of completion, as if a circle that had been left open for 15 years was finally being closed. The ceremony concluded with informal conversation over coffee and light refreshments that the hotel had provided. The atmosphere became much more relaxed, and Sarah found herself sharing stories about her life in Cedar Falls and her work at the cafe. The senior officials seemed genuinely interested in how she had transitioned from military to civilian life, and several of them mentioned their own plans for retirement and second careers. "Have you ever thought about writing a book?" Secretary Williams asked at one point. "Obviously not about the classified aspects of your service, but about the transition from military to civilian life, about finding meaning and purpose after a career in special operations. I think it would be valuable for other veterans going through similar transitions." Sarah considered the suggestion seriously, but ultimately shook her head. "I think my story is probably more useful as an example than as a narrative. I'd rather help people by doing than by telling, if that makes sense." As the afternoon drew to a close, Admiral Richardson presented Sarah with a leather portfolio containing official copies of her award citation and several photographs from the ceremony. Everything was marked with the appropriate classification stamps and security warnings, but they would serve as tangible reminders of this recognition. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as the group prepared to disperse. "Now you go back to your life," Admiral Richardson replied simply. Nothing changes except that you know the full truth about what you accomplished, and a small group of people in government will remember that truth as well. The medal doesn't come with any ongoing obligations or expectations. As Sarah prepared to leave the hotel, each of the officials took time to shake her hand and offer personal thanks for her service. Their words were heartfelt and specific, making it clear that they understood the significance of what she had sacrificed and accomplished. The drive back to her cafe gave Sarah time to process the ceremony and consider what it meant for her future. The Distinguished Service Cross felt surprisingly light around her neck, but its emotional weight was considerable. She had spent 15 years believing that her last military mission had been incomplete and unsatisfactory, and now she knew that it had actually been one of the most successful operations of its kind. More importantly, she had come to understand that accepting recognition for her military service didn't diminish or complicate her civilian life, but rather provided context that made both halves of her existence more meaningful. She was still Sarah the cafe owner, but now she was also Sarah the decorated veteran, and both identities could coexist without conflict. When she arrived back at Sunrise Cafe, her part-time employees were just finishing the afternoon shift. They asked politely about her meeting with the supplier, and she gave them a brief, vague report that satisfied their curiosity without revealing anything significant. As she locked up the cafe and prepared to go upstairs to her apartment, Sarah realized that the most remarkable thing about the day was how unchanged everything looked. The tables and chairs were in their usual positions, the espresso machine was clean and ready for the next day, and the familiar smell of coffee and pastries lingered in the air. Tomorrow, she would open the cafe as usual and serve coffee to her neighbors, but she would do so with a deeper understanding of the connection between different types of service and the knowledge that both her past and present contributions to the safety and well-being of others had been meaningful and recognized. 6 months after the ceremony at the Mountain View Inn, Sarah's life had settled into a new rhythm that somehow felt both familiar and transformed. The Distinguished Service Cross remained locked in a small safe in her apartment, too sensitive to display, but too meaningful to forget. She had found a way to honor both the recognition and her desire for privacy by occasionally touching the medal when she needed to remind herself of the full scope of her life's work. The cafe continued to thrive, but Sarah noticed subtle changes in how she approached her daily interactions with customers. There was a deeper sense of purpose in her work now, an understanding that serving coffee to her neighbors was part of the same continuum of service that had once taken her to dangerous places around the world. Both roles involved caring for people, protecting their well-being, and contributing to the fabric of community that made civilization possible. Mrs. Henderson still arrived every morning at the same time, still ordered the same coffee and muffin, and still shared stories about her family and observations about life in Cedar Falls. But now Sarah listened with the enhanced appreciation of someone who understood how precious and fragile these ordinary moments really were. "You seem different lately, Mrs. Henderson observed one Tuesday morning, settling into her usual spot by the window. "More settled, if that makes any sense. Like you've made peace with something that was troubling you." Sarah smiled as she delivered the coffee and warm blueberry muffin. "I think you might be right about that. I've been doing some thinking about my past and my future, trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together." "And have you figured it out?" "I think I'm getting closer. Sometimes it takes a while to understand that different parts of your life aren't separate chapters, but all part of the same story." Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. "That's very wise, dear. I spent too many years thinking that my teaching career and my retirement were completely different lives. It wasn't until recently that I realized they were both about nurturing and helping others grow, just in different ways." These kinds of conversations had become more frequent and meaningful for Sarah. She found herself engaging more deeply with her customers' stories, seeing connections between their experiences and her own journey of understanding how service and purpose could take many different forms. David Park had finally given up his attempts to convince Sarah to be the subject of a newspaper feature, but their relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared appreciation for the Cedar Falls community. He often brought his laptop to the cafe to work on articles, and Sarah enjoyed hearing about his efforts to tell stories that mattered to local residents. "I've been thinking about what you said a few months ago," David mentioned one afternoon as Sarah refilled his coffee cup, "about some people being meant to work behind the scenes. I think I'm starting to understand what you meant." "How so?" "I've been covering all these community events and local government meetings, trying to find the big dramatic stories that would make headlines. But I'm realizing that the most important stories are often the quiet ones. The teacher who stays late to help struggling students, the neighbor who checks on elderly residents during snowstorms, the business owner who creates a space where people can connect with each other." Sarah felt a warm surge of recognition at his words. "Those are the stories that really matter, aren't they? The ones that show how people take care of each other in small ways every day." "Exactly. And I think I've been overlooking those stories because I was looking for something more dramatic or newsworthy. But drama isn't what makes a community strong." David's evolving understanding of journalism reminded Sarah of her own journey toward appreciating different types of service. Both of them had learned that the most meaningful work often happened quietly, without fanfare or public recognition, but with consistent dedication to making other people's lives a little better. The seasonal changes in Cedar Falls provided a natural rhythm for Sarah's reflections on her new understanding of her life's work. Spring brought new growth in her garden and renewed energy in the community as people emerged from winter isolation. Summer brought increased tourism and busier days at the cafe, but also outdoor festivals and events that showcased the strong social connections that made the town special. Fall was Sarah's favorite season, with its crisp air and spectacular display of changing leaves in the surrounding mountains. It was also the time of year when she had first arrived in Cedar Falls 15 years earlier, tired and uncertain about what kind of life she wanted to build for herself. Now, looking back on that younger version of herself, Sarah felt both compassion for the struggles she had faced and pride in what she had accomplished. Winter brought its own challenges and rewards, with shorter days and heavier snow, but also the cozy intimacy of a small community drawing together for warmth and mutual support. The cafe became an even more important gathering place during the cold months, a refuge where people could escape the harsh weather and connect with their neighbors over hot drinks and warm conversation. One snowy December morning, Admiral Richardson surprised Sarah by walking into the cafe. She hadn't seen him since the award ceremony 6 months earlier, and his appearance brought back a flood of memories from that transformative day. "Admiral," she said warmly, moving to greet him at the counter. "What brings you back to Cedar Falls?" "I was in the area for a conference in Billings, and I thought I'd stop by to see how you were doing. I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit." "Of course not. I'm always happy to see you. Large black coffee, no sugar." "You have an excellent memory." As Sarah prepared his drink, Admiral Richardson looked around the cafe with obvious appreciation for the warm, welcoming atmosphere she had created. The space was decorated for the holidays with simple but elegant touches that enhanced rather than overwhelmed the cafe's natural charm. "This really is a remarkable place," he said as Sarah brought his coffee to a quiet table in the back. "You can feel the sense of community as soon as you walk in." "That's exactly what I was hoping to achieve when I opened it. I wanted to create a space where people could connect with each other and feel like they belonged to something larger than themselves." Admiral Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "Mission accomplished, I'd say. But then, you always were good at achieving your objectives." They talked for nearly an hour about Sarah's life in Cedar Falls, her work at the cafe, and her reflections on the awards ceremony and its impact on her understanding of herself. Admiral Richardson listened with the same careful attention he had shown during their first meeting, asking thoughtful questions that helped Sarah articulate feelings and insights she was still processing. "I've been wondering," Sarah said toward the end of their conversation, "about other people who served in similar roles. Are there others like me, living quiet lives in small towns, carrying memories of classified missions that no one can ever know about?" "More than you might think," Admiral Richardson replied. "The nature of special operations means that many of the people who do the most critical work fade back into civilian life without public recognition. Some of them struggle with the transition, but others, like you, find new ways to serve and contribute that give their lives meaning and purpose." Do they ever receive recognition for their service? When possible, yes. The process is slow and complicated because of classification issues, but there's a growing understanding within the defense community that people deserve to know the truth about what they accomplished, even if that truth can never be shared publicly. Sarah found this information both reassuring and sobering. It was good to know that other veterans were receiving the recognition they deserved, but it was also a reminder of how many people had made significant sacrifices for their country without any expectation of acknowledgement or reward. After Admiral Richardson left, Sarah spent the rest of the day thinking about the broader community of people who had served in specialized roles, protecting others in ways that could never be publicly celebrated. She realized that she had become part of a different kind of community now, one that existed mostly in the shadows, but was connected by shared understanding of service and sacrifice. As winter turned to spring, and Sarah approached the first anniversary of learning the truth about Operation Silent Phoenix, she found herself thinking more frequently about the future. The cafe was successful and financially stable, her relationships with customers and neighbors were strong and meaningful, and she had finally made peace with the integration of her military and civilian identities. But she also felt a growing desire to do something more, to find additional ways to honor the recognition she had received and the knowledge she now possessed about the importance of different types of service. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh, the young mother who worked part-time at the real estate office, approached Sarah one morning with a proposal that would change everything. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I've been watching how you interact with people here at the cafe, and I think you'd be perfect for something I've been thinking about organizing." "What kind of something?" "A support group for military veterans in the area. I know there are quite a few people in Cedar Falls and the surrounding communities who served in various branches, but I don't think they have many opportunities to connect with each other or talk about their experiences with people who understand." Jennifer's idea immediately resonated with Sarah, but it also raised concerns about maintaining her privacy and the secrecy that still surrounded aspects of her service record. "What made you think of me for something like that?" Sarah asked carefully. "Well, I know you're a veteran, and I can see how much you care about people. You have this way of making everyone feel heard and valued. I think other veterans would trust you and feel comfortable opening up around you." Sarah realized that Jennifer was offering her an opportunity to use her experiences in service of other veterans, without requiring her to reveal any classified information about her specific roles or missions. It was a chance to help people who might be struggling with some of the same issues she had faced during her own transition to civilian life. "I'd like to help," Sarah said finally, "but I think we need to be very careful about how we structure something like that. People need to feel safe and respected, and some veterans might not be comfortable sharing very much about their experiences." "Absolutely. I was thinking we could start small, maybe just an informal gathering once a month where people could have coffee and conversation. No pressure to share anything specific, just an opportunity to be around other people who understand military culture and the challenges of civilian transition." Over the following weeks, Sarah and Jennifer worked together to develop their vision for what they started calling the Coffee and Connection Gatherings. They decided to hold the meetings at the cafe on Sunday afternoons when it was normally closed, creating a private space where veterans could gather without the distraction of regular customers. Word spread quietly through the community, and their first meeting in April attracted 8 veterans representing different branches of service and different eras of military history. The group included Tom Bradley from the bank, who had served in the Navy during the Gulf War, a retired Army sergeant named Maria Santos who worked as a substitute teacher, and several other residents whom Sarah had known for years without realizing they were fellow veterans. The meetings quickly developed their own rhythm and character. Sarah found herself naturally taking on a facilitating role, helping guide conversations and ensuring that everyone who wanted to speak had an opportunity to be heard. But she was careful to participate as an equal member of the group rather than positioning herself as a leader or expert. The conversations ranged from practical topics like navigating VA benefits and healthcare systems to more personal discussions about maintaining military friendships, dealing with civilian misunderstandings about military culture, and finding new sources of purpose and meaning after leaving service. Sarah was particularly moved by stories from other veterans about their struggles to find civilian work that felt meaningful after years of service in critical roles. Many of them had experienced the same sense of disconnection that she had felt initially, the feeling that nothing in the civilian world could match the importance and intensity of their military responsibilities. "I spent 20 years as a combat medic," shared Maria Santos during one of their meetings. "Every day, I was responsible for keeping people alive under the worst possible conditions. When I retired and started substitute teaching, I felt like nothing I did mattered anymore. It took me a long time to realize that helping kids learn and grow was just a different way of serving." These stories helped Sarah understand that her own journey from special operations to cafe owner was part of a larger pattern of veterans finding new ways to contribute to their communities. The specific roles might be different, but the underlying drive to serve and protect others remained constant. As the coffee and connection group grew and evolved over the following months, Sarah found herself experiencing a new kind of fulfillment that combined elements of both her military and civilian careers. She was using skills she had developed as a special operations soldier, situational awareness, crisis management, building trust under difficult circumstances, to help fellow veterans navigate challenges in their civilian lives. The recognition she had received through the Distinguished Service Cross had given her the confidence to embrace this new role without feeling like she was betraying her commitment to a quiet, private life. She could help other veterans while still maintaining appropriate boundaries around her own classified experiences. One evening, as Sarah locked up the cafe after a particularly meaningful coffee and connection meeting, she realized that she had finally found the integration she had been seeking between the different aspects of her identity and experience. She was still Sarah, the cafe owner, still committed to serving excellent coffee and creating a welcoming space for her community. But she was also Phoenix, the decorated veteran, using her unique combination of military and civilian experience to help others navigate their own transitions and challenges. Standing in the doorway of her cafe, looking out at the lights of Cedar Falls twinkling in the mountain valley, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place. The young woman who had left the military 15 years earlier, uncertain about her future and carrying the weight of unrecognized service, had grown into someone who understood that service could take many forms and that recognition, while meaningful, was less important than the work itself. The Distinguished Service Cross remained locked in her safe upstairs, a private reminder of what she had once accomplished and a symbol of the trust that had been placed in her by her country. But the real measure of her life's work was visible every day in the relationships she had built, the community she had helped strengthen, and the veterans she was now helping find their own paths to meaningful civilian service. Tomorrow, she would open the cafe as she had every morning for 12 years, ready to serve coffee to her neighbors and continue the quiet, essential work of building the connections that make communities strong. And next month, she would facilitate another coffee and connection meeting, helping fellow veterans understand that their service to others didn't end when they left the military, but simply took new and different forms. Sarah had learned that true recognition didn't come from medals or ceremonies, important as those things were.